the girl by the road. The storm had been building since late afternoon, rolling across the plains like something alive. Ethan Cole watched it from the saddle of his horse, one gloved hand resting loosely on the reins while the wind pressed against his coat. Out here, weather didn't ask permission. It arrived when it wanted, took what it wanted, and left the land quieter than before. Ethan understood that kind of leaving. He nudged the horse forward along the narrow dirt road that cut between miles of empty ranchland. The nearest town sat almost 40 miles behind him, and there was nothing ahead except scattered properties and forgotten structures that time had decided not to erase. He preferred it that way. Solitude wasn't lonely when you chose it. A sharp gust swept dust across the path, forcing Ethan to lower his hat. That was when he saw her. At first, she looked like nothing more than a misplaced shape against the gray horizon. Small, still, out of place. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a child standing beside a rusted trailer that leaned slightly to one side, its metal siding rattling under the wind's pressure. Ethan slowed the horse. The girl couldn't have been more than 7. She wore a faded pink jacket too thin for the weather and boots that were clearly too large, as though they had belonged to someone else first. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. She didn't wave, didn't step forward. She just stood there, watching him. Ethan dismounted carefully, keeping his movements deliberate. Children, like animals, sensed uncertainty faster than adults did. "You lost?" he asked, his voice steady but not loud. The girl shook her head. "I'm guarding," she replied. The answer was so unexpected that Ethan frowned. "Guarding what?" "My mom." The wind surged again, carrying with it the hollow clang of loose metal. Ethan glanced at the trailer. One window was patched with cardboard. The steps leading to the door were warped and half-detached. "You out here alone?" She hesitated, then nodded toward the door. "She's inside. She's sick. I'm making sure nobody bothers her." The statement was delivered with such fierce seriousness that Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. The girl wasn't pretending. She believed this was her responsibility. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mia. I'm Ethan." She didn't respond to the introduction. Instead, she studied him like she was deciding whether he counted as a threat. Finally, she stepped aside. "You can come in," she said, "but don't be loud." Inside, the air was heavy with heat and stillness. The faint smell of medicine mixed with something older, neglect, maybe. The trailer was sparsely furnished, the kind of place people didn't live in unless they had run out of options. A woman lay on a narrow couch beneath a thin blanket. Her face was pale, strands of dark hair stuck to her temples. A small table nearby held prescription bottles, most of them nearly empty. Ethan didn't need a doctor to tell him she was in trouble. Mia hovered close, watching his every move. "She hasn't woken up much today," the girl whispered, "but she told me to stay brave." Ethan crouched beside the couch. The woman's breathing was shallow, uneven. On the floor nearby sat a stack of unopened envelopes stamped with final notice in red ink. One had fallen open, revealing a letter about lapsed insurance coverage. Another kind of storm, he thought, the kind made of paperwork and abandonment. His gaze shifted to a picture frame turned face down on the counter. He picked it up without thinking. A photograph of the woman, healthier, smiling. A man stood beside her, one arm around her shoulders. Mia, younger but unmistakable, sat between them. Someone had deliberately flipped the frame over. Ethan set it back exactly where it had been. "You don't got to fix anything," Mia said suddenly, her small voice edged with worry. "We're okay." He looked at her, really looked this time. Her bravery wasn't natural. It was inherited from necessity. Ethan stood and walked to the door, stepping outside into the rising wind. The sky had darkened to a bruised purple, thunder murmuring in the distance. He pulled his phone from his pocket, turning it over in his hand. He hadn't used it much since deciding the world worked better when it stayed far away. Helping people had once cost him everything. Trust had once felt permanent, until it wasn't. Until betrayal walked into his home, wearing a familiar face, and left with half his life. He could leave now, right away. Tell himself this wasn't his problem. The storm would cover his tracks. Behind him, the trailer door creaked open. Mia stood there, holding it with both hands as if the wind might take it. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask him to stay. She just waited. Ethan looked down at the phone again. Then, with a long breath that felt like stepping across a line he'd drawn years ago, he unlocked it and began to dial. The call rang once, twice. As thunder cracked across the plains, Ethan lifted the phone to his ear and chose not to walk away. The call that changed direction. By the time the ambulance lights cut through the storm, the rain had begun to fall in hard, slanting sheets. Ethan stood beneath the narrow awning of the trailer, hat pulled low, while Mia clutched his sleeve with both hands. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't explained. She had simply decided he was someone to hold on to. Sheriff Tom Walker stepped out of the vehicle behind the paramedics, his broad frame unmistakable even through the weather. He gave Ethan a long look, half surprise, half question. "You don't usually call for company," Tom said. "Didn't figure this was something I should handle alone," Ethan replied. That was explanation enough. Tom didn't press further. Inside, the paramedics moved with efficient urgency, checking Lena's pulse, her breathing, her temperature. The clinical rhythm of their work filled the small trailer. Mia stayed close, silent but watchful, as though memorizing every movement in case she needed to repeat it later. "She's severely dehydrated," one of them said, "and she should have been treated days ago." Ethan didn't respond. He already understood what neglect looked like. Not always intentional. Sometimes it arrived, disguised as abandonment, unpaid bills, and the slow collapse of support systems. They lifted Lena onto a stretcher. Her eyes fluttered briefly, unfocused, catching only fragments of light and shadow. For a moment, her gaze rested on Ethan. Fear passed through it, then confusion, then exhaustion pulled her back under. Mia stepped forward quickly. "I'm coming too." "You are," Tom assured her gently. "We'll ride together." The ambulance doors closed, sealing mother and daughter inside. The siren didn't blare. Out here, there was no traffic to clear, no need for noise. Just distance. Tom remained behind with Ethan as the vehicle disappeared down the muddy road. "You want to tell me what pulled you into this?" Tom asked. Ethan stared toward the fading lights. Kid was standing guard like a soldier. Figured that wasn't normal. Tom nodded once. "Hospital's 45 minutes out. I'll make sure they're admitted without delay." Ethan reached into his pocket and handed him a folded card. "Use that," he said. "Whatever it costs." Tom didn't take it immediately. "You sure about this?" "No," Ethan answered. "But do it anyway." The sheriff accepted the card without another word. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and overworked machinery. Ethan arrived later, after securing his ranch and changing out of his rain-soaked clothes. He hadn't planned to come. He told himself the call had been enough. Yet his boots carried him down the corridor anyway. Through the glass of a small observation room, he saw Mia sitting upright in a chair too large for her, swinging her legs without touching the floor. She wasn't crying. She wasn't playing. She was waiting. Tom stood nearby, filling out paperwork. "She's stable," Tom said quietly as Ethan approached. "Doctors say she'll recover, but it'll take time. Illness got worse because she stopped treatment." "Couldn't afford it," Ethan guessed. Tom handed him a file. Inside were copies of notices, account closures, legal correspondence. One name appeared repeatedly. Daniel Reeves. Partner cleaned out their savings, Tom said. Walked off months ago. Left her with medical debt and a kid. No criminal angle. Just a man who decided responsibility wasn't convenient. Ethan closed the file. Betrayal rarely looked dramatic on paper. It hid behind signatures and withdrawals. Mia spotted him then and slid off the chair. She walked straight over, stopping just short of grabbing his hand this time, as though unsure whether she was allowed. "They're helping her," she reported. "That's good," Ethan replied. "You came back," she added. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Ethan shifted his weight, uncomfortable with how much that mattered. Had to make sure things were handled. Mia studied him with unsettling seriousness. "Most people say they'll come back. They don't." Before Ethan could answer, a nurse approached. "She's awake for a few minutes," she said. "One visitor." Mia looked at Ethan, not the nurse. He hesitated, then stepped into the room. Lena Hart looked smaller, surrounded by hospital equipment. The sharp lines of illness softened slightly now that she was conscious, though fatigue lingered in every movement. Her eyes moved to Ethan, wary but alert. "You're the one from the trailer," she said, her voice rough. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. "I assumed this wasn't charity," she continued. "People don't involve themselves for free." Ethan leaned against the wall, keeping distance. "Didn't do it for you." Her brow tightened. "I did it because your daughter shouldn't have to guard a door like that," he clarified. The tension in her expression shifted, not gone but altered. She looked toward the window, absorbing that. "I'll repay whatever this costs," she said after a moment. Ethan shook his head. "Focus on getting well. I don't accept favors." "It's not a favor," he replied evenly. "It's temporary help." Lena studied him, tried to find motive, obligation, expectation, anything that explained why a stranger would intervene without asking for something in return. She found none. "That kind of help doesn't exist," she said quietly. Ethan pushed away from the wall. "It does. It just doesn't come with promises." He turned to leave. Behind him, Lena spoke again. "Why would you trust a situation like this?" Ethan paused at the doorway, his answer arriving without effort. "I don't," he said. "I just know what happens when no one shows up." He stepped back into the hallway, where Mia waited, watching him like someone measuring whether the world had shifted. For the first time in years, Ethan wasn't sure himself, and that uncertainty followed him all the way home. What staying looks like. Recovery was not dramatic. It did not arrive with sudden strength or grateful smiles or declarations about second chances. It came slowly, measured in small improvements that most people would have overlooked. Lena Hart returned to the trailer 2 weeks later with a bag of medication, strict instructions, and a future that still looked uncertain. Ethan did not ask whether she wanted help. He simply showed up the following morning with lumber in the back of his truck. Lena watched from the doorway, arms folded, suspicion sharpening her expression. "You don't need to do that," she said as he unloaded boards. "I know," Ethan replied. That was the entire conversation. He began repairing the steps without waiting for permission. Each movement was deliberate, practical, and entirely unconcerned with whether she approved. He worked the way he managed everything on his ranch, quietly, without commentary. Mia sat nearby on an overturned bucket, observing like an apprentice. "Why are you fixing it?" she asked after a while. "Because it's broken," Ethan said. The answer satisfied her. Lena, however, remained unconvinced. She had lived through promises before. They usually came wrapped in charm and disappeared once they became inconvenient. This man offered neither warmth nor explanation, which somehow made his presence more unsettling. "You don't owe us anything," she insisted later. Ethan drove a nail flush with the wood. "Didn't say I did. Then why keep coming back?" He paused, considering the question as though it required an honest answer. "Because leaving would be easier," he admitted. "And I'm trying not to choose easy." Lena had no response to that. Days formed a rhythm. Ethan repaired what needed repairing. A leak in a roof, a failing water pump, a section of fence that had collapsed long ago. He brought groceries, but left them on the counter without acknowledgement. He never stayed long enough to be called a guest. Lena noticed what he did not do. He didn't ask about Daniel. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer advice or pity. He behaved as though her past belonged entirely to her. That restraint unsettled her more than curiosity would have. One afternoon, Mia followed Ethan back to his truck. "Do cowboys always fix stuff for strangers?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then why you?" Ethan leaned against the door, searching for words simple enough to explain something complicated. "Because somebody should have done it for me once," he answered. Mia nodded, accepting that explanation without needing the details. Children understood fairness better than adults did. Lena's strength returned gradually, but healing brought its own kind of discomfort. Independence had once defined her life. Now she found herself relearning ordinary tasks, while a man who expected nothing continued to appear at the edges of her days. One evening, she found him repairing the old garden plot behind the trailer. "That died months ago," she said. Ethan kept turning the soil. "So plant something else." "It's not that simple. It is if you don't try to grow the same thing again." The statement lingered between them, carrying more meaning than the conversation required. For the first time, Lena saw not just what Ethan was doing, but what he was avoiding. Whatever had driven him into isolation still lived behind his eyes. He understood damage not as theory, but as experience. "Someone hurt you too," she said quietly. Ethan didn't deny it. "That's not important. It is if you try to fix everyone else." He finally looked at her. "I'm not fixing anything, just keeping things from falling apart further." The distinction mattered. A week later, Sheriff Tom arrived with news neither of them expected. Daniel Reeves called the station. Tom said, removing his hat, "Not asking about you, asking about legal exposure." Lena absorbed that without visible reaction. The confirmation hurt less than it should have. He wanted to know if abandoning shared debt counts as liability. Tom added. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Tom looked at Lena. "You want to respond?" She thought about the months of silence, the empty accounts, the slow unraveling of everything she had trusted. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm done answering questions he should have asked himself." Tom nodded, satisfied, and left them alone. That evening, Mia planted the first seeds in the garden Ethan had cleared. She worked with exaggerated seriousness, patting the soil flat as though sealing an agreement. "What if they don't grow?" she asked. Ethan crouched beside her. "Then we try again." Lena watched them from the doorway, something unfamiliar settling into her chest. Not dependence, not obligation, stability. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't demand gratitude. It simply existed, built from repeated choices to return. She stepped outside, standing beside Ethan. "You never said you'd stay," she observed. He brushed dirt from his hands. "Didn't need to." Lena looked at the small rows of freshly planted earth, then back at him. For the first time since her life had collapsed, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something being quietly rebuilt, and neither of them yet understood what that might require. What remains after the leaving? The truck arrived just after sunrise. Ethan noticed it first from the pasture, an unfamiliar vehicle cutting across the long dirt road toward the trailer. The engine's sound carried differently from the slow, familiar rhythm of local traffic. It was impatient, out of place. He rested his forearms on the top rail of the fence and watched without moving. Some things did not need introduction. By the time he reached the trailer, Lena was already outside. She stood very still, as if motion might somehow make the moment worse. Mia lingered behind her, half hidden, sensing tension without understanding it. Daniel Reeves stepped out of the truck. He looked like a man who had once been comfortable in his life and was no longer certain where that comfort had gone. His clothes were neat, his expression rehearsed, but there was a restlessness in the way he scanned the property, as though measuring how much had changed without him. His eyes landed on Lena. "I've been trying to reach you," he said. Lena did not respond immediately. The silence forced him to continue. "I heard you were sick. I didn't know it had gotten that bad." Ethan remained several steps away, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough to make it clear this was not his conversation. "You knew I was sick," Lena replied at last. "You just didn't stay long enough for it to matter." Daniel exhaled, the sound heavy with frustration rather than regret. "Things were complicated." "They weren't," she said. "You left." Mia's small hand found the edge of Ethan's jacket. He didn't look down, but he stayed exactly where he was. Daniel noticed the gesture. His gaze shifted to Ethan, assessing, uncertain. "And who is this?" he asked. "No one you need to worry about," Lena answered. The truth of that statement was sharper than accusation. Daniel stepped closer, lowering his voice as though intimacy might repair what absence had broken. "I made mistakes. I can admit that. But we can fix this. I can help now." Lena studied him carefully, searching for something she might once have recognized. Affection, responsibility, even guilt. She found none. "What you mean," she said evenly, "is that you want to return now, that leaving didn't work out the way you planned." Daniel didn't deny it quickly enough. The wind moved through the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of turned soil from the garden behind the trailer. Evidence of work, of time, of presence. Things Daniel had not been there to see. I'm still Mia's father, he insisted. At that, Ethan finally spoke. She knows, he said. That's not the question. Daniel frowned. I don't recall asking for your input. You didn't, Ethan agreed. But you showed up here, so now you've got it. The exchange wasn't hostile. It didn't need to be. Calm certainty carried more weight than anger ever could. Lena stepped forward before either man could continue. This isn't about punishment, she said. You made your choice months ago. We've made ours since then. Daniel looked around again. The repaired steps, the reinforced fence, the small green shoots pushing up from the garden rows. You're just going to pretend this is enough? He asked. No, Lena answered. I'm going to accept that enough doesn't come from promises. It comes from who stays. The words settled into the space between them, undeniable. Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly, as though he had finally encountered something he couldn't negotiate his way around. He looked at Mia, perhaps expecting hesitation, perhaps hoping for recognition strong enough to anchor him. Mia didn't move toward him. She stayed beside Ethan, not out of rejection, out of certainty. Daniel nodded once, the gesture more resignation than understanding. Without another argument, he returned to his truck. The engine started, gravel shifted beneath the tires, and within moments he was gone. No dramatic exit, no final declaration, just absence. For a long time, none of them spoke. The quiet that followed felt different from the silence that had once filled the trailer. That silence had been hollow. This one felt settled, like something finished rather than abandoned. Lena let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I thought I'd feel angrier, she admitted. You don't? Ethan asked. No. She looked toward the road where Daniel had disappeared. Just done. Mia tugged gently at Lena's sleeve. Can we water the plants now? Lena smiled faintly. Yeah, we can. They walked to the garden together. Ethan followed, not leading, not directing, simply present. Mia carefully poured water over each row, her concentration absolute. What happens if they grow big? She asked. Then we take care of them, Lena said. And if they don't? Ethan answered this time. We plan again. Lena glanced at him, recognizing the quiet promise in the words. There was no grand confession waiting between them, no sudden transformation of gratitude into romance. What existed was steadier than that. Trust, built one return morning at a time. You know, Lena said, you never asked to be part of this. Ethan shrugged lightly. Didn't plan to be. Are you planning to leave? He looked across the open land, the same wide horizon he had once chosen because it kept people at a distance. Now, it held something else. Not today, he said. It wasn't a vow. It didn't need to be. As the sun climbed higher over the plains, 3 sets of footprints crossed the soil, close enough to show they walked together, far enough to prove each step was still a choice. And for the first time, none of them were guarding against what might be taken away. They were learning how to keep what remained.